and welcome back to our panel, One World, Many Ways to Tell a Story. I hope you all enjoyed your lunch break, because now we have a very special panel to look forward to. As you can hear, it will be held in English, but it's also structured a bit differently because it consists of a keynote and a talk. This will be very interesting for all aspiring journalists and for everybody who's interested in a really good story. Our first keynote speaker is a freelance photojournalist. His aim is to capture stories with maximum authenticity. He doesn't use any official lights like flashes or reflectors while taking his pictures. He wants to capture the raw moment to really convey the story. He's already worked in several countries like Libya, Egypt, Iraq, and many, many more. It is not about taking a pretty picture for him, but really letting people see what reality is. Please give a warm welcome to our keynote speaker, Philipp Breu.
Hey guys, have a good afternoon. I was asked to do the whole thing in English, so excuse if I might take a second more or less for finding a couple of words or phrases or whatever. So just to introduce myself very quickly, my name is Philipp. I'm a 28-year-old photojournalist. I'm originally from Bavaria, from Passau, a small city called Passau. And I went to Berlin for my studies of Islamic science and history 5 years ago. And I still live in Berlin. I still love the city very much, and it's a good headquarter to live in as a freelancer. And after school, I started my career with an internship that I did in Lebanon at a newspaper called The Daily Star. And I did study neither journalism nor photography, so I'm self-taught. I learn everything by myself and basically by doing. So and I started getting into journalism when I was still at school. I had several workshops and classes with Youth Press Germany, Youth Press Bavaria, and so on. And this is where I got into this whole journalism thing. And after a couple of years, and especially when I did this internship in Lebanon, I saw that the writing part in this whole journalism is not so very much for me, but I rather saw my talents in taking the photos, actually. So 1 year after my internship in 2011, I took it to a whole new level, and I'm not going to say I got rid of the writing part, but I tried to do more photography and less of the writing, because for me it was more fun. And I also saw my talent in this field rather than in the writing and doing the research. And in 2011, I started to do research and to produce my very first story in what we know now as the Arab Spring, which started for me in Egypt, in Cairo, as for many other promising photojournalists that are in the field nowadays. And in 2011, I was still studying, but I was very, very curious, and for me, this was like this massive protest going on in the Middle East, which was already like the focus of my interest, also because of my studies. So I really wanted to go there. And in the summer of 2011, I went to Cairo, and to be honest, I didn't know shit about freelancing. I didn't have any really good contacts, and I didn't know a lot about how to produce stories, how to pitch them to clients. I didn't have a lot of contact, so everything I basically learned on the streets with colleagues, just by taking photos, showing them to other people, and establishing my contacts that I still have nowadays, or maybe not. And initially, I went to Egypt to produce a story on the they call garbage people. It's like the lowest class of people you can find in Cairo. It's very poor Christian neighborhoods that are collecting the garbage all over Cairo to earn a living. For me, this was a story that I saw while I was still studying, and I wanted to go down there and do research on these people, talk with them, and maybe produce a photo story about them. But of course, because it was Cairo and because it was the Arab Spring, you don't live in Cairo and work in Cairo on a story like this and not be influenced by what was going on the streets. These massive protests that were occurring like every weekend. This was a protest against in front of the court that was actually set up for convicting Hosni Mubarak, which was ousted by the protesters. So yeah, this was my first contact with this kind of journalism that I was doing on the streets, and also with this level of police violence that I've never witnessed before in Germany. I covered protests and demonstrations before, also in Germany, of course, but it was not the same at all. It was completely different. I had to deal with shitloads of stones, police brutality, tear gas, and all that stuff. And the definition of press freedom was entirely different than I had witnessed anything before anything I had witnessed before in Germany. But for me, it was, of course, because I was still young. I was very experienced. I was a very, very green journalist, so to speak of. It was very interesting for me. I was a very curious young journalist. And for me, the rate of learning was massive. Every day I learned something new, and I met great people that I'm still friends with. I still have a lot of connections to Cairo until this day. I went there for a vacation in July. A lot has changed, but still, on the other hand, a lot of things have still stayed the same very much. So basically, I think all of you guys know these pictures from 5 years ago when it happened, and yeah. So this was my very first steps into journalism. I was doing my work. I was telling people stories, and of course I met people like you do in journalism. And then I was meeting a Colombian journalist who really desperately wanted to go to Libya. While there was already the civil war going on in Libya since March 2011. I arrived in summer, and for me this was I'm not going to say I wasn't interested in participating in this civil war, but I was very aware of the fact that I didn't have enough experience, and I didn't have the contact, and I wasn't established in the community, in the journalistic community. So I decided to focus on the story. I went to Cairo for intention initially, but what happened was that I met the journalist, and she really wanted to go to Libya, and she needed a photographer, and she asked me to come with her. And who would I be to say no? I don't want to go there. So I wanted to go with her, and in the very last minute she backed out because she was. I think she was also not prepared enough for this trip, so she backed out, and I was like, we prepared everything, we have all the contacts set up on the border, these guys are waiting for us. And I called the one contact that I had in Germany, a small magazine that I still work for, and I asked these guys, do you have anyone in Cairo right now, because there is a possibility to go to Libya and cover the war there. And they said they actually have a guy. I called him up the very same minute, and I asked him, hey man, I know it's really this is on a very short notice, but do you want to go to Libya with me? And this guy was like, I'm going to give me 5 minutes to think about it. And after 5 minutes, he called me, and we took the next bus to Libya, which was my first war. And until I went to Iran for the first time, this was the best week of my life. It was absolutely beautiful, I think, because in August 2011, the rebels already knew that they would be winning against Gaddafi's forces. It was only a matter of time until the war was over, in favor to them. And I think because of the reason that both of us, my colleague and me, were both really young, very unexperienced, and all of these guys over there in Libya also saw that we were really green, So they saw, oh, we have to help these guys, we have to take care of them. And I think this was also this took a very big part in the fact that they really wanted to make us feel comfortable and helped us so much, and we had a great week in Libya. You probably have seen all the photos from Benghazi. Lots of people with guns. I've never seen so many people with guns before in my entire life. And for me, this was something I have never seen before either. This was, of course, war brings destruction. It brings refugees. It brings a lot of guns, like I said. Very young people. Libya was a revolution of the young people that have never served in any army or armed forces before. So, and we arrived in Benghazi in the middle of the night, and we saw that people were literally shooting on the streets because they were very joyful. it was August, and it was, like I said, they knew that they would be winning after a while, and they really wanted to show foreign journalists, maybe also especially because we were Germans, and the Germans have a very good stance in the Middle East. They really wanted to show us Libya is a nice country, Libyan people are very nice, and they really wanted to show their success regarding the war to us. So they, we found this militia, we really found them in the street, and they were like, "Hey, do you want to join us? And we go to the front line tomorrow. You want to come with us?" And they took us in just like that. Yeah, this is me back then. So we spent a couple of days with these people. Slept in the same buildings as they did. This is what is nowadays known as embed journalism. So you don't go there as like an independent journalist in the way of you have your own vehicles, your own translators and stuff like that, but someone provides it for you and you're embedded with some kind of military force. And these people actually take care of you, and they give you you're sleeping in the same places where they do, and you're eating with them the same food and all that stuff. So this was my first kind of embed journalism. And to be honest, I just took photos of everything I saw. I didn't really have an idea what I was like, what kind of journalistic story I was pursuing. I didn't really have that like concrete idea that I would have now when I go to foreign countries, especially the wars. But for me, of course, it was an adventure. Of course, it was. And it was entirely different from what Syria was afterwards, because in Syria there was and still is a massive risk of being kidnapped, which in Libya it existed, but it was not the same at all. So we didn't there was no peril of a bounty on our heads because we were journalists or Germans. So we saw a whole lot of the country, we met a lot of people, everybody was very happy to meet us. And we arrived to what was the front line by then, which was a city that has been liberated from Gaddafi's forces only like a couple of hours before. And it was already cleaned of enemy forces, but driving around this town with the rebels felt very... I didn't know exactly what I was in there, and I didn't know if there would be any snipers or whatsoever, or if there would be any, I don't know, IEDs, bombs or whatever. So I was not exactly sure what I was into. And when we saw that these rebels back then, they looted a lot of houses, and at some point they also told us not to film this and that. And because it was our first experience, after a week we decided to call it a trip and say, okay, we should go now because we're not experienced enough for this. We know that the war is going to end probably in the next few weeks, and it would be really nice and interesting to stay, but we shouldn't probably, because we don't have the journalistic experience to cover it in an appropriate way. And from Libya, I also brought you guys a video. Hope it works.
صور كتائب قذافي أموال الناس يجمعوا فيها ياخذوا فينا أموال الناس ريت هم جايين أنا صريغ ريت هذا اللي كان قاعد هنا من الكتائب كان يسرق من الحواشين هذينا اسطوانات الغاز ويجمع فيهن هنا ويمشي يبيع فيهن هذينا اسطوانات أهل بن جواد كلهم لا جو تماما تعال اطلع برا هيك حولك لا مواطن معلش طمنوا بس انت شايف ان المنطقه دي اكثر من مره تو نحن نصيحة والله نصيحة عائلات اليوم اطلعها من هنا تبقى العلم عدل صوتك الشارع ولا الشارع يسبحونا يجيبوا لك حافلة يسويك حاجة الله أكبر الله أكبر صورنا طمنا على الشياب جبنا في الجزيرة تم ارفع الفرش سلم لي على الشياب دار زنقة راسنا نوف طهرناها شبر دار بيت جليزة حمام حيطة أرض حيطة قصة منورين ثورة يا ظالم حياك يا زبدان كلفت اهو تعال شوف تعال شوف غنائم قذافي انا ممنوع اوكي.
As you could see in the video, these guys fighting house by house, me and my colleague, we had a lot in common with these guys actually, because they didn't know shit about how to deal in a war, how to be a soldier, and I didn't know shit about how to be a journalist, but we learned by doing. So I think this is maybe a reason why these guys liked us so much. But nowadays, when I prepare stories, it's of course a whole lot different, because wars like the one in Libya don't exist in this way anymore, because journalists have become we are not considered a neutral part of a conflict anymore. We are something to be used, even in a way that people can make money from you. And in war zones, that means, of course, that your government, the German one, is going to pay ransom for me and for other people, which happens all the time. So we have to be very careful what you're doing. This is, for example, a reason why no Western journalist has reported out of Aleppo since 2 reasons, because it's just too dangerous to go there anymore. Fast forward, I continued to do a couple of stories in. I went back to Egypt to do a follow-up on my Christian garbage collector story. I was in Turkey for the protests in 2013, and by early 2014, I decided to produce like a whole other story that was that I found very interesting, which is in northeastern India, where coal is like the major resource for all the people, even for the country. It's like the major source of income for a lot of people, and also the major source of energy. And because it's India, it brings a lot of corruption, and there's a lot of harvesting coal from the ground in the way that it destroys the environment entirely. And as it happens in rundown, corrupt countries, the first kind of people that suffer from all this harvesting is like very poor regular people, the ones that are connected to the coal in a way that they live very close by, or they are even directly involved in the coal business because they're working there. So I spent several weeks doing research in this in this part of the country. I mean, India is a very vast and a very big country, so you have to go. Sometimes you take a train, and you have to spend the night, and you have to drive cars for an awful lot of hours, and you have to spend a lot of money on fixers and translators. And in India, in every state, they speak a different dialect. So, but I was really interested in this story, and I did this in a couple of cities where coal was affecting people differently in a way that it would be, it would either mean destruction of the environment, or there would be a lot of child labor. In other cases, you have severe health issues. People are being resettled for extending coal mines and stuff like that. So I did research for about a month. I traveled maybe for, I think, 5 weeks. I think about 5 weeks. And the very spark that led me to produce this story was the same, almost exactly the same like the years before. The way that I produce a story is I pick something up that interests me, and in my opinion, something that should be reported. And I don't really care that much about the interest of newspapers and magazines, publishers. And for this story also, I didn't really check if someone would be interested or would like to buy it. And in the end, the worst case actually happened. And until this day, same as in 2014, when I first pitched this story to my clients, no one was interested. Like, not a single picture out of the story was ever published, and no one was interested to publish this story. They all told me the same. There is no connection to Germany whatsoever. This is something that has been happening for 100 years. It's not news. We can't publish this. So over the years of my career, this approach on how to do journalism, on how to produce my stories has changed drastically, because, of course, at some point I want to make a living from this profession. So, not as in the beginning of my career, I just go somewhere and I use my own money to produce stories, and I risk like losing all of that money to the story and not getting a single euro or dollar back from it. I still pick up stories somewhere, and I want to produce stories that interest me and not someone else, basically. But I check beforehand if this story actually could be sold, if I could make any money from this story. And sometimes when a publication shows interest, they're gonna tell you, we are like basically generally interested, but we only want to cover a certain aspect of this. So in order to make money, you have to change the approach how you do a story. And we may have that discussion in the panel later, but this is a very interesting and a very critical question on how to produce a story in a way that you still feel connected to it, you still can cover for this 100%, but you also can make money from it. Because as a freelancer, like every euro that you make from this job is critical. So of course, in countries like Cairo and in Egypt and Libya, you don't care so much about how much money you make out of this, because it's very much an adventure and you enjoy every minute being in there. And because I was so young, maybe that's a reason, you don't have to pay that much, because people see that you're unexperienced and you're not this fancy kind of journalist who brings the ballistic vest and the helmet and the shitloads of equipment and the car and the translator, but you come only with maybe 1 or 2 bags and that's it, and you don't have to pay that much. In the beginning this all works, but later it becomes more difficult, also when you work in very remote areas like this one in India, where people really don't speak English. You have to get translators, you have to prepare yourself, you need contacts. It's not so much about the equipment is not the expensive part. So these are all different aspects of the story about the negative effects of the coal mining in India. This is a small village, for example, that has been set up by the government in order to house about 50,000 people that have been resettled in order to extend the mine, because people were living on this on the proposed new area of this mine, so they had to be resettled forcefully, of course. Also coal fires like this one is a massive problem. Coal is burning constantly and people are breathing the fumes, they get lung diseases and all kinds of stuff. So yeah, and I think that's it, yeah. Same year I went to Mali. Mali was my first sub-Sahara African country. I had a beautiful time there. I did a culture story. I worked on how the minority of the Christians is dealing in a country that is 97 or 98% Muslim. And I did a story about, maybe you have heard of it, Mali had a very nasty war in 2013, early 13. The French troops came and saved the country basically, and in the city of Timbuktu, in the northern part of Mali, in the middle of the desert, they had a very rich cultural heritage, which consisted of hundreds of thousands of Islamic manuscripts. And in order to save these manuscripts from the Islamists, from these heavily armed people coming from the desert, taking all these towns in Mali, they had to hide these documents and smuggle them in more safer parts of the country. And I did a story on on the background of how these documents were saved and smuggled, and on how the city of Timbuktu, where I went with a colleague, actually lost its entire heritage because the documents have been removed from Timbuktu and now they're being stored outside of this city, but they never went back. So the city that was once a hub for economy and culture lost both of these aspects entirely. And now the government has received a lot of money from foreign governments, like the one from Germany, in order to restore these documents and to catalog them and scan them. And this is the city of Timbuktu. Really beautiful. And the empty libraries. They had maybe about a dozen libraries, some small, some big, and now all of them were empty. Not a single book left. And these are the people that have been helping to get these documents all like in boxes, in small boats, in vehicles, and get them out of the city and save them. And these are some of the documents that couldn't been saved because a lot of these Islamists, they burned a couple of these documents just to piss off institutions like the United Nations, to show them we can do whatever we want here. Also for me, because I studied Islam, this was very interesting. They have a very different African way of performing their religion. Very beautiful. You may have seen these mosques made only from muds and bricks. Really beautiful architecture. And for this story, for example, I worked with a guy that did videography. So I was able to do the photography and also some of the writing, and he did some of the writing and the videography. So for both of us, this was a mutual benefit. We were able to offer 3 different kind of media to our outlets, to our contacts, and we sold a lot of different stories, got published in a very nice way in some magazines, really layouted very beautifully, and we were very happy with the outcome. This was a story that I very much appreciated to do research about and to take photos of, and for me it was very important that this was actually seen by someone. This is a guy who invited us to his house, and he still had some of the he still had some Islamic manuscripts that he inherited from his grandfather, and he wanted to keep them. He did not want to give these documents to some place in the capital where they would be safe, because he said, I'm not going to see them afterwards anymore. I want to keep these documents for myself. Yeah, and this is a priest who took us in for an afternoon, because I also did research about the Christians in this country. Yeah, that's it. That's Mali. In the fall of the same year, I traveled to Iran. Iran is a country that has been in the media a lot lately in very good ways. I went there for... this was not so much about making money, this was rather about I wanted to research the kind of Islam they're actually performing there, because as you may know, it's a different, in Islam you have many different aspects and sects, and the way that Islam is performed in Iran is a lot different than from other countries. So I went there for a festival called Ashura, which commemorates a battle that has been taking place almost 400 years ago, and they remember one of their imams which has died, and he's considered a martyr now. And it's a beautiful festival. And I could work there very freely. People would not even ask me why you take photos, why you do this, as it happens in many Middle Eastern countries sometimes, because people are like curious in a way that they are more like concerned citizens. They're not exactly police or some kind of authority, but they want to know what agenda you have and why you take these photos and in what way you would show them. So this happens a lot in the Middle East, especially in countries that have been ravished by wars, like Lebanon, where I've spent a lot of time. People always ask who you work for, but not in Iran. In Iran, I could work very freely. If you ever have the chance to go there, do it. It's such a beautiful country. In Iran, for example, it depends very much on what kind of story you work on, because this was a very unpolitical story. Like I could always say I did this as out of touristic interest, but if you actually work in this country as a journalist on a very political topic that includes, like, I don't know, political opposition or the death penalty, or you do some kind of critical stuff that actually is an issue, it's a different thing, of course, because they're not going to have a problem with you taking photos of religious ceremonies, but, I mean, you guys know Iran, there is just topics you don't report about. This was another embed I did in Iraq. As you know, there's a war going on in the northern part of Iraq now, in Kurdistan, and the German army, as many other European armies, are training the Peshmerga, the security forces of, what we call the security forces of Kurdistan. So, for this story, for example, I approached the German army, I talked to their public relations team, and I tell them, I'm going to be in the country in this period of time, is it possible to visit you guys? If they say yes, if we have an appointment, I'm going to go forward to my clients, to my to newspapers and magazines I work with, and I'm going to pitch them this kind of story. If they're interested, if they want to have like certain pictures, if they have different aspects they want to have covered, and then I go there and I try to get the story for them. This still happens very much as you see it in the pictures now. They're still being trained. They're fighting a really nasty war now in Mosul. This is another story I did in the very same country, in the Kurdish areas. One of these stories that I cared very much myself about, but the publishers were not so interested in. I didn't sell this story as the story I intended to show it, but I was able to sell one aspect of this story and then another story from Iraq, and both of them like in comparison. How the story was about how people deal with war. And this guy, he's a German monk who is hosting Iraqi refugees in his monastery. This was one of the two persons. So I didn't sell the story as monk hosting the refugees, but two people, how they deal with the effects of war, with the influx of refugees, and this guy was one of them. So he's actually from Berlin, became a monk a long time ago, settled down. Really interesting character, and he's like, He's housing 200. Yeah, it's 200. He's housing 200 people from very little funding. He doesn't get a lot of money from United Nations, any refugee councils. He does everything by himself, and he does it with $1,000 a month, a week. Very astonishing work. And these are usually the stories I want to do. They are somehow connected to social and conflict issues, but I'm not exactly showing the front lines because this is stuff that other people are more experienced in. And the real interesting stories are, in my opinion, behind the front lines. They're not so much at the front line themselves, the shooting, the killing, that stuff. Of course, this is something someone has to report, but I don't feel like the person to do it. For me, these stories about individuals that have done something valuable for society, interesting stories behind the front line on how war is affecting people, conflict and social issues are affecting people is a lot more interesting. So here, for example, you can see that this is the church of the monastery, and he's hosting so many people in this monastery that even in the church itself, he has to host refugees, and you can see that because they want to have some privacy, of course, he divided the church in a couple of different sections, and in the bottom left section, you see that small kids are still sleeping while church service is actually held on Sunday morning. And these refugees are all from the same city that is currently in the process of liberation. So if they're lucky, in a couple of weeks, a month, they can go home, or can go to, they can try to go home in a way that if they're lucky, their house is not destroyed, they can actually go home, because a lot of these towns and cities that are being liberated or have been liberated by now are heavily destroyed, so it doesn't mean necessarily they can actually go home. And one of my most important stories was the refugee influx last year, the big migration crisis, as it was called by the media. So the first time I went to Lesbos, of course. You've seen all these photos from this little Greece island. But I did it in a backwards way. The first trip I did was actually not to Lesbos, but I took a bus from Berlin to Hungary because they shut down the border between Hungary and Serbia. So I started from Hungary and Serbia, then worked my way back down to Croatia, because all the refugees were like shifting from going to Hungary rather to Croatia, and I went to Croatia with them. And from there I went the whole way with the refugees to Germany. And 2 days later I went to Lesbos, so I did it in like the opposite way. And you've seen these photos, of course, so this is stuff I've seen for the first time in my life. Police beating refugees, beating people. It was very harsh for me to see. I had several emotional breakdowns on this trip because it was really something not easy to witness. People would burn their passports. And I'm still friends with many of these people, because by that time I did the trip last year, my Arabic was a lot better than it was several years ago. I was able to speak with people, to communicate with them, and I'm still friends with a lot of these people. After this trip, I went to Lebanon for Arabic studies for 4 months. And after Lebanon, in February, I decided to do the trip one more time, but this time with the focus on one family. So by February, refugees were still coming to Lesbos. And on the ferry from Lesbos to Athens, I met a family from Syria that didn't speak any English, so my Arabic studies were like really, I could put them to proper use. And I spent more than 2 weeks with this family, because we traveled from Athens to the northern border of Greece, to the border with Macedonia. And as you may heard in the news or not, the border closed down, I think, by end of February. So we arrived just a couple of days late. We did the whole trip from Polycastro to the border, 30 kilometers. I had 40 kilos of equipment with me. But these people, like, they treated me like one of their own. They didn't really know me because we just met a couple of days before, but they treated me like one of their own. Really nice people. And the sad thing is that after 2 weeks in this refugee camp that was known as Idomeni, I left, and we were not able to cross the border. And these guys are still in a camp in northern Greece. They were never able to cross the border. And I think they had an uncle living in Düsseldorf, so they wanted to come to Germany naturally. And I think for a brief time, I was the only journalist actually living in the camp, and I was also the only one who did I lived exactly the same as the refugees in this camp. I lived in the same tents. I had the same way too thin sleeping bags. We awoke every other couple of nights because it was so cold, so miserably cold. Standing in line 3 times a day, over 1 hour for really, really, really disgusting food. So it was a very emotional trip. Yeah. You've seen these images, I guess, from the camp. Not from the family, but you've seen the camp. Yeah, this is it basically. Yep. So for right now, I'm planning to prepare another trip to Iraq because I wanna cover how the battle for Mosul that you have probably reading about now is how it is concerning the people actually that are from Mosul. So I'm not, like I told you before, I'm not very much interested in what the war exactly looks like on the front line, but how it is affecting people. So are people going back to the cities that have been liberated shortly before? How many refugees are coming out of Mosul now? How are they living? This is something that I'm more interested in. So right now I'm preparing another trip, and I want to work on how I'm going to shape the story and which of my clients would be interested in that. Yeah. I think that's it.
Thank you so much. You can take a